So before we get started, I do have to make one sort of a correction. Last week, we had a great time giving the class in the morning. One of the benefits of having a class recorded is that people who aren't here are able to see the classes. Another benefit of having the class recorded is that if you make a mistake, someone else can point out something to you, and you may not. So I was very fortunate that I want to apologize with all sincerity to Richard Dawkins, because I must have said that Richard Dawkins was dead, whereas it's Christopher Hitchens is the one who's dead. I'm talking about the angry British atheists, and both Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens were in that company. I must have said that that Richard Dawkins was the one who died in 2011, but indeed it was Christopher Hitchens. So my apologies if anybody from Richard Dawkins' family is watching the share. You learned of your relative's demise. He is alive and kicking. He's doing great. And my apologies to the family of Christopher Hitchens, who later in his life did realize that he was Jewish.
You keep saying Dawkins. You keep saying Dawkins.
No, Stephen Hawking, not Stephen Hawking. He's a different. He is alive. Yeah, I'm not. Stephen Hawking was not mentioned at all last week. There are three British scientists who we're talking about. Two of them are alive and one is dead. Okay, Stephen Hawking was never mentioned in the sheet.
I thought that's who you meant.
No, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. So again, Richard Dawkins alive, Stephen Hawking alive, and Christopher Hitchens no longer with us. Now that we've gotten that cleared up, let's get started. Not Richard Dawson. And we've got.
Come on down, he's dead.
Come on down.
Richard Dawson is dead.
Bob Barker's alive.
You think? Let's just say. I just want conversation has to cherry. It can only go low. It can only go up. I'll let it go down just a little bit more before we go up. You think? How many of us think of Richard Dawson not from there, but from Hogan's Heroes? Schultz. I see nothing. Okay, we got to stop this. Let's go a little bit. So last week, I guess what we're talking about in this, you know, the copy of it. You need any more sheets on it?
Please, thank you.
Last week we started talking about some issues of science and the way that the Chumash presents the story of creation. We looked at different approaches towards resolving and dealing with, or you allegorize certain things, whether you understand the science differently, whether you understand the psukim is referring to specific phenomenon that scientific research refers to. That's what we talked about last week, and we gave a couple different approaches to that. Today we're going to talk about something very different. We're going to talk about looking at sort of like non-traditional sources that could help us perhaps shed light on things going on in the Chumash, and trying to figure out the role that plays in yeshiva high school sort of education. That's something I want to talk about. We talk about generally when we learn. Generally, when we're going to learn, when you learn Chumash, there are basically several different approaches you can take. You can take the approach of like the newer school, let's say an Israeli Tanakh learning nowadays, is to really is to not focus as much on like in midrashim and parshanut, necessarily, but to look at the psukim themselves, like they're basically taking the Tanakh without any mefarshim, and like understanding the Tanakh on its own terms without necessarily going through parshanut. There's also schools that will look at the the traditional parshanut that you'll find in the Mikra Kedolot, and you also have people who look at midrashim. There's another question that comes up as to whether or not there are other sources you should take a look at that can shed light on issues in understanding Chumash. Today I want to look at two different types of things. I want to look at texts that were around during the time when the Chumash was happening, and see if that sheds light on anything, and see how we can what the role of that might be. And the second thing is not just text, but also looking at kind of, let's say, archaeological findings that might shed some light. So what I'm gonna do with you is basically precisely what I did with your son's class. I'm teaching this 11th and 11th grade class in Breshit. So one of the things we started with basically Parshat Noach. I started with the class, and then the beginning of Parshat Noach and the end of Parshat Noach, we looked at two different stories that I want to share with you a condensed version of something I did there, and kind of like raise it for your, for conversation. Again, as I say, if there's any questions, comments, yell out. You don't need to raise your hand. Just scream and let me know if you want to say anything. We'll start with the first thing. Towards the middle of the 19th century, there was a big discovery in Iraq. There's a professor, a Syriologist from England, working for the British Museum, who, when doing sort of like archaeological digs in what is now Iraq, discovered some cuneiform tablets, and they figured out what they were referring to. And one of the more famous findings there was this what ends up being one of the oldest records of a story that you have that we have in writing, and that is something that precedes the time that we talked that the Chumash took place, that the Avot appear precedes the episodes of that we have in our Chumash. This talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, so the Epic of Gilgamesh, a lot of us may have read it in college, in kind of world literature courses, and like that. One of the questions that comes up, though, if you take a look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it sounds a lot like the Mabul. I'm going to get it's long, so you apologize. Excuse me for the lack of scholarly credentials here. I'm taking it straight from Wikipedia. But after looking all over for some kind of condensed version of it that I could just photocopy, they're like 3-4 pages long. It's the interest of condensing things. I basically just took the summary of the 11th tablet from the Wikipedia. My apologies for that. If you want to Google it, and you can find the full text on this later. But take a look here. Let's just glance at it. I underlined some of the things that I thought were more kind of similar to the story. I want to read this with you and then see what, and then we'll ask some questions about this, okay? This is the basic summary. Gilgamesh observes that Utnapishtim, okay, seems no different from himself. All right, Gilgamesh is the hero of the story. He's looking to figure out how he can get eternal life. He wants to get eternal life. That's what's going on in this story that we're reading here. And Utnapishtim is the guy who has eternal life. So he seems no different from himself, and he asks him how he attained his immortality. So Utnapishtim explains that the gods decided to send a great flood. And to save Utnapishtim, the god Ea told him to build a boat. He gave him precise dimensions, and it was sealed with pitch and bitumen. Okay? His entire family went aboard, together with his craftsmen and all the animals of the field. A violent storm then arose, which caused the terrified gods to retreat to the heavens. Ishtar lamented the wholesale destruction of humanity, and the other gods wept beside her. The storm lasted 6 days and nights, after which all the human beings turned to clay. As everyone seems to have disappeared. Utnapishtim weeps, and he sees the destruction. Okay? His boat lodges on a mountain, and he releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven. When the raven fails to return, he opens the ark and frees its inhabitants. Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice to the gods, who smell the sweet savor and gather around. Ishtar vows that just as she will never forget the brilliant necklace hangs on her neck, she'll always remember this time. When Ellen arrives angry, the survivor, she condemns for neglecting the flood, etc., etc. Okay, now, at this point, Utnapishtim and his wife are blessed, and they get eternal life. Okay, this is the story that's existed pre-Bible. Okay, so what a question. What kind of questions would you ask from this when you're looking at Chumash? What kind of questions? I don't know if you're a high school kid, would you ask? You can understand yourself. What kind of questions come up?
Similar, it's not the same.
Similar, not the same. Correct. Well, who cares? Well, is it good or bad for us that it's similar enough? That there are similarities.
You're saying this pre-existence
Predates.
enough?
Predates, yeah. Good or bad? You say it's bad. Why do you think it's bad?
God's a copycat.
Sounds like God's a copycat. Okay, fine. Sounds like God's a copycat. That's good. That would be the bad argument. Yeah, what do you say?
Or as a high school kid, some of them would argue, well, the Torah wasn't written by a god, it was written by a person.
Okay, fine. So another look at it might be like, this seems to implicate. You might argue this looks like similar to other written documents. Sounds like it's like Not, you have the better version. God's a copycat. She's saying some other guy's a copycat.
Right.
It's plagiarism, right? Any other like problems? I don't want to say anything good. Yeah.
During what time was it? Or was it before?
It's everyone's going to agree that it's like a couple of, it's like probably at least 1,000 years before Chumash comes around.
Or we say historically there was such a thing.
Yeah, the other presentation, which you'd say is this actually terrific.
Right.
Finally, we have other sources that indicate that there was something a flood. In other words, if there was something as devastating as the Mabul, we would expect that there would be somebody else in the world would say something about it. So one could argue that religiously this is like terrific. Confirmation.
It's like children's story.
What's that?
But that means they would have survived. According to our version, the only people who survived was Noah and his family. Everybody else was wiped off.
Okay.
So if somebody's recording it based on historical events,
Correct. That's fair. In other words, what you would say then is that historically, the details of our story are something's got to be off in the details of it. But you'd say that the existence of multiple flood stories would lend confirmation to something like this happened. Even if someone's got to be like off in the details of it, though. Yeah.
I don't really see anything bad in it.
Mhm.
It's like, well, to some extent, like it's like children's stories. You wanted to continue the legacy, so sometimes you change here and there the names. Like Goldilocks in one country it's like told this way, and in a different country it calls like with different names.
Mhm.
So, but the story itself and the main things are existing.
Mhm.
The main motives are there. So.
Right. So I'm going to present to you a couple of different, I'm going to share with you what I did in my class with this. And I'll talk about kind of educationally, like what I think makes sense. Everyone have sheets? You have sheets? No, you have a sheet?
I have.
Yeah. Okay, fine. One of the things I want to share with you two different. So as you can imagine, it's not. If you look in the Mikro Kadol, you're not going to find much about this because this was picked up in the 19th century. No one knew about this really, for a long time. So you find people who are more, contemporary people are going to talk about this a little bit. I want to show you. There's this guy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. This is like an interesting book. It's this guy. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. Leon Cass is an interesting character. Leon Cass is a professor at the University of Chicago. He's a somewhat, he's somewhat traditional in certain ways. Not traditional in other ways. He's professor. He's an MD who was very involved in bioethics. He gave a course at University of Chicago about Genesis, and then it turned into like a whole study thing. And he started getting a little more traditional, get involved with some of the more some of the students and faculty at the University of Chicago, and then he put together this book. It's very interesting. It's like I got a lot of interesting approaches towards understanding Chumash. He's an interesting character, Leon Cass. He basically has an interesting approach that a variety of some other from Mefarshim have as well. Most notably, Kasuto is the one traditional Perush that talks about. Kasuto is an Italian rabbi who wrote a commentary on the Chumash. He develops this idea very much in a book he wrote called he wrote a 2-volume book. One of them is Mi Adam ad Noach, and then from Adam to Noach, and then another book called Mi Noach ad Avraham. And it's basically those two books he deals with basically Breshit through Parshat Lech Lecha. He was not able to finish the rest of his parish during his lifetime, but it's not so easy to get copies of the book either. But it's terrific. So this Cass develops some of the ideas that Kasuto talks about. Cass has them here in a nice, concise way in English. I want to share with you what he says, and I think it's interesting. Okay. What Cass does, and what Kasuto also does, they look at the differences between the two stories. Not the similarities, what are the differences? So what are the differences between the flood story as we know it from Parshat Noach And the flood story, as you get it in the summary from Epic of Gilgamesh. What are like major? There's subtle differences, but meaningful subtle differences. Okay, there's not the you're looking at a summary of the text. It's not the exact text, so it may not be totally fair. But I'm gonna go through some of the things that he says, which I think are kind of interesting. He has five major differences. God's decision to destroy. You see what I'm looking at the bottom there on the left. God's decision to destroy the earth, unlike Enlil's, is not arbitrary. It's a response to near universal wickedness and corruption of life on earth. Not so much by punishment as by purgation and purification. God seeks to erase the evil that has polluted his creation. In other words, if you look in the Gilgamesh story, the gods get together and there are different you have different versions actually. One version has because the people were making too much noise, and it was annoying the gods. At that point, the gods decided the gods decided to get rid of it. That's like one difference. In other words, you have in the Chumash, what you have is the story of the Mabul is a response to corruption. There's a moral dimension to it, which you don't have in Gilgamesh. Two, unlike God decides to spare Noah not out of caprice or favoritism, but on account of Noah's virtue, right? Noah was a ish tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav et Elokim yitalech Noah. Noah was considered to be a righteous person. That's why he deserved to be saved. In other words, the destruction was a destruction because of moral corruption, and Noah was saved because Noah was the lone guy who was a moral person. Was just, right? That's the second difference. Third, unlike the gods and goddesses of the Gilgamesh legend, who were terrorized by the wild natural forces they themselves have loosed, in a later quarrel amongst themselves, God is in full command of the chaotic waters, and his say is at one with himself. That's another major difference is when you read Gilgamesh, multiple gods who are not in control. They unleash this flood. The story speaks of them hiding and being worried that they're going to be affected by it. There's no sense of Hashem having a sense of fear or unsure. There's an strong element of control. Okay. 4, unlike the Mesopotamian deities who starve for human offerings, swarm over the sacrifices eager to eat, God merely smells the odor of. He does not eat Noah's burnt offering. In other words, the korban that Noah offers at the end, the pasuk says, "By yarach et reach hanichoach," God smelled. And some of the Mefarshim have to point this out as well. That the Kasuto points this out very neatly. Kasuto says, if you look at in the Gilgamesh, they talk about the sacrifices that were made. It says that the text of the Gilgamesh epic has God smelled the sweet savor, and they descended on the sacrifice and swarmed around it like flies on meat, and they proceeded to eat the sacrifice. So Kasuto points out that there's something much more refined, much more spiritual than presenting the multiple gods as actually having this human-like blood. Eating it, the sense of vayarach et reach hanichoach as being something much more refined, just the smell. And finally, he points out, unlike Utnapishtim, Noah does not himself design the ark, but merely executes to the letter God's very detailed instructions. Moreover, there's no gold and silver, and there are no craftsmen and helmsmen on Noah's ark, it's just him and his family. One thing he points out later that's not in this list, and the biggest difference, is what's Noah's reward that's different than Utnapishtim's? What's immortality. He dies. In other words, he dies and he has a pretty rough life after. Things don't end up well. The fact that Noah is saved, but the years that followed the destruction, you very much feel in Noah's life, almost like that, the feeling of it's I don't want to compare exactly, but it's like sometimes you have the survivor who just of the Holocaust who's broken and cannot move on, and you respect that and understand it. You sort of feel like that's what goes on at Noah the rest of his life. Well, I mentioned that as an aside from this thing, but talking about Noah, it moved me very much. I once heard Rav Lichtenstein once gave a very beautiful talk on it was on Yom HaShoah. He was talking about something very beautiful. He talked about the same exact mitzvah was said both to Adam and Chava as well as to Noach and his wife. The mitzvah of Pru Revu. The same exact command, populate the world. Talk about you have the same exact mitzvah in two different contexts can mean something totally different. When you're looking at Adam and Chava, a world that's just been created, the future is so exciting, and you can have this blank canvas that you're going to be able to build a world on. It's a very exciting sort of adventure, as opposed to when you are the same mitzvah of Pru Revu after the world has just been destroyed and so much has been changed and it's been disappointed, and you have that canvas has been ripped up and you've got to erase that canvas and start anew. It's a whole different sort of mentality, even though it's the same thing, and you treat it differently. He was talking about that in terms of I think it was in terms of building the Jewish people and Torah learning after the Holocaust. You have the same mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but being Jewish and having the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, Rav Lichtenstein was trying to develop this idea that post-Holocaust it might mean something that's just very different than pre-Holocaust. Okay, that's neither here nor there, but I just thought about it as I thought it was a very powerful idea. This is something Castles. So again, those differences are huge. You got to we have to take note of that. And so and we'll try to figure out. So what about that? Just in 1 second. I also want to point out the other piece of this. Take a look. There's another book written by a guy who's also not so traditional, but he writes great stuff on this. Professor Nachum Sarna, who he lived in Boca. Lived in Boca. The last 20 years of his life lived in Boca. He lived in Boca. He was a professor at Brandeis for a long time. His son is very, his bestseller. His son is a big American Jewish history scholar at Brandeis. Son just wrote a book. It got very well received. He wrote a book about it was in the news I think last year, the year before. He wrote a big book about the General Ulysses Grant's. He wrote this. He had this. During the Civil War, they kicked the Jews out of a couple of states. They expelled the Jews because they thought they were sort of like supporting the South, right? So he wrote a whole big book on it. It was like very well received, very interesting. He's like he's a very interesting scholar of American Jewish history. His son, Jonathan Sarna, who's at Brandeis. Professor Nachum Sarna, who was a Bible scholar, again, for the last 20 years of his life, he taught at FAU. He taught at FAU for part of the time. I think he was ill for last number of years of his life. He lived
right here.
He lived right here.
Yeah, you lived right here.
He lived right here.
Part of our community.
Yeah. So he was like
Wonderful, special, fine people.
So he's that's cool. He's a major scholar. I mean, written a tremendous amount of books. A major sort of Bible scholar. So I want to just share with you one excerpt that I have from his book that he wrote called Understanding Genesis. He died in 1985. 2005. He came here in 1985. He died in 2005. The foregoing study of the biblical deluge story leaves no room for doubting the direct connection between it and the Mesopotamian tradition. It's so silly. There's a connection. So what does he think? He had a closer look at the two and a careful understanding of the purposes of the Bible leave us with quite a different impression. The Hebrew version is an expression of the biblical polemic against paganism. This assault is carried on not on the level of dialectics, but indirectly and inferentially. In other words, it's not saying a textbook of an argument as to why paganism is wrong. By presenting the story of the Mabul differently than had been accepted tradition, the Torah is trying to teach certain truths. Through an inspired process of selection, revision, and addition, whether deliberate or intuitive, the original material has been so thoroughly reshaped as to become an entirely new and original creation, purged of its polytheistic dross. When the Mesopotamian tradition was apparently of local importance, came in the Bible a major event of cosmic significance. What there is largely casual and contingent has become here causal and determinative. Like the creation narrative, that of Noach and the flood has made into a vehicle for the expression of some of the most profound biblical teachings, an instrument for the communication of universal moral truths, the medium through which God makes known what he demands of man. In other words, but what his argument is, and this is kind of the way I presented it in my class, is that it's important to take a look at one of the reasons why I think it's good to look at the story of Gilgamesh. I'd say for two things. One, well, actually, we'll talk about that maybe in a second, but, well, two reasons why I think it's important to look at, from my position. One of them is, this is world literature, and I would much rather control the message rather than have a situation which I would not want to put my students in the position of, they go to college, and they're like, what's going on here? This sounds like Torah's a copycat of this. I prefer to own the message in a way that I think is meaningful. And the second thing is not just preventing something bad from happening, but I actually think like, oh, you know what? If I look at some of the differences here, I'm developing a better understanding, I think, of what the Torah is trying to convey to me. I would not necessarily, when I'm contrasting it with what other people around that time would have been thinking. In other words, if you understand what, let's say, people thought about a tradition of a flood back in the day, then I can pay more careful attention to differences, to nuances in the Chumash, which I'm now aware of, which I've not necessarily been aware of. Oh, that Bayarach, et Reach, and Ichoach, that's as opposed to the gods swarming around. The fact that the Torah emphasizes ki shchit kol basar, that everything was corrupt and corrupt and corrupt. It's emphasizing that to point out that it's not what pagans thought, that it was like a random, capricious act of the gods. Noach is the tzaddik, tamim, each tzaddik tamim b'dorotav, emphasizing that there's the moral quality to it, and those kinds of things. And finally, that Noach at the end is saved. Humanity goes on, but Noach is a regular guy, and we don't believe that people attain this level of immortality. Like when I recognize that, and you see, it makes a little more sense to me when you see the sad, like almost like pathetic, like life that Noah has after the Mabul. Why is that it? Oh, it makes a little more. Is that actually to contrast it with the immortality of Tanapishtim? Like people are regular. We're like normal people. Right? That's like an interesting thing. So if you turn the page for a second here, I want to share with you. Okay, the photocopy doesn't have the exact, maybe the cut chopped off a little bit there. There's a great article written by a man, some of you may know him. He was a mentor of any Shiva Flatbush people here. Any graduates of Shiva Flatbush? Usually we have one or two in a crowd.
Married into it.
Okay.
Married into it also.
So Dr. Joel Walowski, it was my first job out of Smicho. I taught Yeshiva Flatbush. And so Dr. Walowski was a mentor of mine there. He's still in Yeshiva Flatbush. He, he's teaches math and Jewish philosophy. He wrote a number of articles about science and Judaism and stuff like that. He wrote a great article, appeared a couple of years ago in the Journal Tradition, called A Note on the Flood Story in the Language of Man. Okay, I'm going to share with you a little bit of what he says about his suggestion about teaching this in Yeshiva High School. I think it's interesting. Okay, I'm going to read. I just took a couple of excerpts out of the book, out of the article. And take a look at that. Now, well, this may be very interesting. He's talking about looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not clear how relevant it is. Paganism is long gone from Jewish consciousness. One need not look past the text and its traditional commentators to know that the true God, unlike the false deities worshipped by the pagans, is moral and caring, that it brings judgment on the world, has established a covenant with mankind in general, and later the Jewish people in particular. What then is to be gained from taking note of the Gilgamesh epic in a Torah class? In other words, like, you can live nice, good, frum lives, understand the Torah very well, and recognizing that God is moral and just without looking at Gilgamesh. There are at least two simple answers in his position. First, the Torah itself took note of the epic, and a comparison of the two makes any other conclusions difficult. Then we should take note of it. Second, it reminds us that, we are reading a Torah text that is neither allegorical nor historical, but kilashon b'nei adam. This is, in his version, this is again, there are a lot, we could give a whole shiur on what it means when it says Dibra Torah, Kolashon B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language that people understand, expressing things as they were discussed by the multitudes, and not necessarily as they were in actual detail. We'll talk this in a second. This frees us from such questions as, how did animals from frigid climates survive in the Mediterranean? Peruvian Indians and Australian Aborigines are really descended from Noah himself. In a previous version of this, he had an article. I thought he had a little more sarcastic of a line, or whether or not we believe that kangaroos hopped from Australia to Mesopotamia to get into Noah's Ark, and then after that was over, hopped back without having any kids on the way. Yeah, right. Needless to say, this approach no more suggests that there was no catastrophic flood than does the position that God has no physical limb. Claim that He took us out with a mighty arm is false. That we were never taken out of Egyptian slavery. It has no relevance to the secular debate on the historicity of the Bible. We are not talking whether the flood happened, but the literary device the Torah used to describe it. In other words, Dibra Torah Kalashim B'nei Adam, he wants to suggest, is basically the Torah is presenting the story of the Mabul in a way that addresses the audience that got the Torah, what they were familiar with. Flood epics, he suggests, were well known in the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, we may have discovered it in the 19th century, but the people who lived back then knew about this. This is a if you were a basically moderately educated person in his position, you knew of the flood epic. Everybody knew about this. So look at the next part he says. I think it's very sharp. How should all this find its way into our educational system? Okay, so he's talking here not just as a learning Chumash, but also talking to teachers, how he thinks that makes sense to introduce this in schools. To be sure, applying this understanding of Dibra Torah to the biblical flood story can be confusing and may undermine a proper understanding of Chumash if presented too early in a child's educational career. But that is not the same thing as allowing a high school or college teacher to not be aware of it or not making it available when a student is ready to hear it. This relates not only to the biblical flood story, but also to the entire anti-pagan polemic of the first few chapters of the Torah. Chumash classes in our high schools and tertiary yeshivot consist almost entirely of piling exegete after super exegete on verse after verse. Okay? Indeed, this should be the core of yeshiva study of Chumash. That's true. That's what you should be learning Chumash with Parshanut. But if it is all we offer, if we do not supplement it with literary analysis and archaeological information, we fall short of the mark that we should be setting for ourselves and our students. While one can lead a good Torah life without ever having heard of Gilgamesh, it seems to me, this is Walwalski speaking, that yeshiva educators would serve their students well by introducing some aspects of it into the high school curriculum. Torah itself provides this model for the model for this approach. Jews entering Canaan were sure to confront these tales, and the Torah guarantees the cure before the malady. How strange and non-enticing these pagan versions must have sounded against the backdrop of a well-learned Torah moral version of the flood story. When students have learned about the Gilgamesh within a Torah environment, there is less chance of a negative reaction upon exposure to an anti-Torah interpretation of the same source material. I thought this was great. And kids don't. Now, some people don't like this idea. They'll still push up against it. When I did this in my class, I gave them a writing assignment. I said, does this, after we did this whole thing, I said, do you think that has this made you feel stronger or weaker about your Judaism?
What did
Okay.
it say?
I had one kid who, they all wrote reflectively. One kid wrote weaker, everybody else wrote stronger. And it was interesting. I felt bad for the kid who wrote weaker. I was like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to make you realize how it's like. But I took that as an opportunity.
Right.
I tried then to. So that for me was I actually was very pleased with the result. I would have felt, I'm happy somebody said weaker because I felt like there's something going on then. They actually were thinking about. And so we took that as an opportunity in class to talk about why it was, and I tried to really present why I think it should present a stronger position, kind of echoing what Walwalski was saying here. And for me, the kid who said it made them feel weaker. I was thinking, I'm happy that he's telling me that now, because trust me, if he's telling me that now when he's 11th grade,
He's thinking about it.
it's going to be a lot more challenging. And I want him to know when he's in college, and I want him to know that you're from good teachers are aware of this. There's something that would be painfully it would be a bad thing if you have a situation when something Walwalski was saying in his piece here, when a kid gets to college and they say they hear about this, and it's like my rabbis didn't even know about this stuff. I like the idea of that student for whom you said it made them feel a little bit weaker, knows that we're talking about this, and there are people who are aware, and it makes them stronger also. So that was I thought that was for me was was like a very interesting experience. I wasn't sure, yeah, go ahead.
Just by hearing all this information, either from the Gilgamesh or from these scholars,
Right.
do any of them feel that it's more allegorical versus historical?
Yeah, so you could see, so you clearly, I don't know if you could sense it, in Walowski's piece, he's clearly trying to make sure people don't think he's like, not frum enough. Like he's saying, I'm not saying it's allegorical or something,
What's his?
but I think what he'll tell you, it's gonna be taped, I don't know what's gonna, don't watch this, Joel,
This is off the
if you're
record.
watching this, I hope I'm right, I'm not sure, I know you pretty well, I understand, but, I'm not sure, you never said this to me, I plead it's clear. I think that he would probably say, he'd say I'm not getting into that, but I think he'd say that, that there is a difference between, Parshiot Bereshit and Noach, until you get to Lech Lecha. I know that, for example, I know Rabbi Jeremy Weider, one of the, he's a little more, out there of some of the YU Rosh Yeshiva. I've heard him say that he thinks that Parshiot Bereshit and Noach are much more part of this anti-pagan polemic, and that he doesn't think that there was necessarily could be, but he doesn't think it's a problem to say that there may not have been a historical Noach, and that this is the message that the Torah is trying to convey as an anti-pagan polemic. That's something that Weider says. That's something that certainly Kasuto says. It's something that there's another article that Walowski is responding to. There's an article by a rabbi, I think he's in Israel now, Rabbi Schubert Spiro. Oh, from Cleveland, So Rabbi Spiro wrote an article that I think Walowski is responding to, that we're in this article tradition, but he comes straight out and says that he thinks it was allegorical, was trying to teach the message, and he thinks was not historical. Noah was not necessarily a historical person, and so he got a lot of flack for that. And so I think Walowski's article is trying to take Rabbi Spiro's thing and tone it down a little bit and say, listen, you can say that basic thing, but still sound like, more traditional.
Don't you think that's a slippery slope, though?
Yeah, I think it is a slippery slope. So I'll tell you, so it's interesting. So the question that you're asking right now is the same question that kids ask me in class. So where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line, right?
There's a rainbow, there's a dove.
So it's
maybe it
interesting.
wasn't, it was a
So
cat.
I think it's an excellent question. I also say though the slippery slope argument is a very practically oriented argument. It's like interesting, but also is the type of thing that is like can sometimes be like morally problematic. Just because something is, it's funny to sometimes say if you think something's right, you shouldn't talk about it because you're afraid that.
No, but why should we automatically assume because we don't understand something at a higher level that it's really not what we think it is? We can just dumb it down and say that, these people really weren't existing, but it's here just to teach us some sort of moral.
Right. So I think that's. I think the question is a good question. But I'll say we already do that by a lot of things. Like the Rambam says, for example, that Gan Eden. It isn't like there's a place called Gan Eden. Gan Eden was teaching us lessons about what the about life, about what the the purpose of the world is. We even when we talk about Bereshit, we have plenty of I was talking about as we mentioned last week. There are plenty of thinkers who don't regard the story of the Sheshet Yemei Bereshit as being something that is to be understood literally, particularly because
because
the
it's
world,
deeper, it's not more shallow.
because the world.
Because
Well, I wouldn't argue.
Our understanding
I
is
would. Yes, I would. What these guys would argue is that this isn't more shallow. That the Torah is teaching us important moral truths, and the Dibra Torah Kalashon Bnei Adam is something that's trying to teach the Jews, the time of Matan Torah, important, deep moral lessons about what the nature of God and the nature of history, and the nature of God's involvement in the world. These are like deep philosophical moral truths that we're trying to present. Now again, I think that your question is a very important one. And this is some of the things that some of my students raise. They say, well, what if I think that
Goliath and David, David and Goliath. Well,
yes,
it's really just an allegorical.
Yes, so
he's strong, he's weak, we win, you lose.
Right. So I would say like this. One of the things that Again, I'm not sure what the answer to the question is. I'll tell you one of the things I once heard Rabbi Weeder say, which I thought was interesting. He said if you read through Parshat Breshit and Noach, they do sound different than the rest of. When you're introduced to Abraham, it doesn't sound. It sounds like normal life when you read It sounds like things that you're familiar with. Once Avram is journeying back and forth, he's dealing with kings, and people have relatively normal lifespans. Also, we're not talking about living 1,000 years. Breshit and Noach sound more like an argument than historical. It's a fair question. And I was like, where do you draw the line? In that level of interpretation, I think is the real. I think that's the most important question, really. I think it's the most important question in terms of talking to high school students in terms of education. Like, where do you draw the line? Does it open up too much of a Pandora's box in terms of like does this mean like if you see this, is a kid going to say, oh, I'll reinterpret Matan Torah, I'll reinterpret Yetziat Mitzrayim, reinterpret Avram. Avram's like a nice moral force, not a real person. There's an idea in the world that you should believe in God, right? So again, I'm not sure where you draw the line. I'm saying what I think that some of these people who are presenting the position as such, as trying to teach us moral lessons, draw the line at the end of Noah. But why draw the line there? Maybe draw it further. I think it's a real question.
Well, why is Gilgamesh so threatening to us? I mean, we already have people that interpret it through Islam. We already have people interpreting it through Christianity, through Hinduism, through any kind of Islam.
I'm not saying.
Is like, why is this something that people have commented so much? There's plenty of room for interpretation, but we feel, I guess, that ours is right and our interpretations are stronger and withstand the test of.
Because what you'd say is that if the Gilgamesh epic existed before the Torah, right, then it makes sense to try to see whether or not what it might the Torah be trying to indicate to us by differences between the two stories. Now,
So it's just timing.
I think so, but I'd say that it does. Let me say again. I think your question is like the sharp question. I think that is the sharp question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's more to be gained or lost. I would say there's more to be gained by noting the differences and then trying to learn what the Torah says. And also, I would keep it as Walowski is like is playing both sides. And he's saying, listen, I'm not getting into I don't know. I'm assuming it's historically true. It's historically true. I'm not saying it didn't happen. But the Torah, in its presentation of it, is emphasizing, I think that's what you were saying. You don't need to go, that's what they're saying. This Rabbi Spiro, who wrote this article, got a lot, the letters to the editor after he allegorized things were very, very sharp. And I think what Walowski is trying to do is have it both ways. I think he does a pretty decent job at it. I'm trying to learn what message the Torah is trying to tell by these literary devices of Dibur Torah Kol Shel Bnei Adam. And I'm not getting into it. I'm not a historian. Also, the Torah's right. The Torah's right. As soon as happened. Yeah.
I think when we teach high school kids, it's like, at least for me, when I was high school, it was like, that was the top of your Torah learning and really like building who you are. Then you go to college and then basically based on what you ask for yourself, you get it. But as parents for children, that's the more you give them. And I think that it's important, yes, to bring it to the class. And yes, to see with your children is basically what do we take from that. Like for me to teach my kids, well, now they're too young, so I just teach them the story of Bereshit and Noach, the details, but it's not really deeper enough what you take from that to life. And it's like it's a whole approach of emunah than really knowing the story itself. And you need to fight with that. You need to bring the other side so they're going to justify that. So for example, it's important for me, even though they're young, our kids, is like to have this Shabbat discussion is like, okay, for example, our kids, we pull them out to public school this year. And then, they walk to the school with their tzitzit and kippah and everything. And then we said to them, what do you say when they ask you, what is that? And it's basically putting them in, well, unfortunately different situations, but like for us, it's good to hear that they're not really struggling, but they have to justify, and they have to put their emunah and say,
Yeah.
this is who we are, and we believe in it, and then.
I
So
think
I
most,
think
for
you
me,
need to bring it to them.
most
You
important
have
thing
to
is,
bring it to
most
the
important thing
class.
is I want to give a message to the students, I'm not afraid. Right? We believe Torah is true, and we stand by a problem. I'm not afraid of talking
We
about
don't teach with our mouth closed.
Yeah, we look at what's going on, we have what to believe in, and we should be proud of it and not be threatened. Okay, I've got 10 minutes left to do my this happened last week also. I've got 10 minutes to do my second part of it, which I think is like, a little bit less controversial stuff, and I think and very interesting. Okay, at the end of Parshat Noah, we have the story of the Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel. Okay, if you look at the psukim, sounds like they're pretty good guys. Right? Take a look at if you have the bottom, towards the bottom of that second page there. Vayichol haaretz safachat devarim achadim. Whole world was one language. They were one speech. They were all unified. Vayiben osam mikedem. They found a place to live. Sounds great. Pasuk Gimel. Vayomri shel reyehu havanil benal lebenim v'nisrafad l'srifah. Let's make some bricks, and we're gonna make some bricks. Pasuk Daled. Let's build a city and make a big tower, and we're gonna make a name for ourselves, because we don't want to be spread out all over the world. Sounds, guys, they're some good guys. I like to live there. Unity. They live in sounds like a circle. They have a big building in the middle of their circle.
We're right, you're wrong.
I'm going to stop with all it sounds like they sound like good guys, but then at the end you see God doesn't seem so happy with them. So that these people built, and he said, "Nah, I don't like it. I'm going to mess up their language, and I'm going to spread them out, and this place is going to be called Bavel." Okay, well, what exactly is going on? What are these people trying to do? So turn the page. I'll show you three interesting things. Okay, there was. In the Mefarshim, when you pick up in the Mikra Kedol, they're going to have two different approaches to this. Okay, one approach is going to be Rashi, who's going to quote citing Midrashim, which basically says these guys, these were idol worshippers. These guys were building this tower because, as Rashi quotes the Medrash, they were Dvarim Achadim, they were unified, unified for like evil. Because Bo be'etza achat v'amru, right? Locally minashibor lo et elyonim. Why does God get to stay up there by himself? Now we're going to make
please come to Mr. Downer's office.
We're going to make what's it called? We're going to fight with God. Another interpretation. They were actually, when it says they were devarim achadim, they were going to fight directly with the one and only God. Basically, you have the approach of the Medrash that Rashi cites, which is to say that these guys in Bavel were fighting against Hashem. They were Ovdei Avodah Zarah. The purpose of their tower was to, prove something and be against God. And that explains then why God seems to have had a strong problem with it and punished them at the end. Okay? Right? What works for this is that God doesn't punish them. There's another approach of the Ibn Ezra, and the Rashbam, and some of the Mefarshim were more associated with the group of, we refer to them sometimes the more Rodfei Hapshat, the people who are much more inclined towards understanding the psukim on their own terms rather than looking to midrashim to figure out what's going on. So Rashi will often refer to a medrash. The Rashbam and the Ibn Ezra are often going to be looking at the just the pshats. With the Rashbam and Ibn Ezra say, basically, I'm not going to look at it on sides, I want to do this quickly. They say, these guys weren't that bad. They're pretty good guys. They didn't do any sin. Avodah Zarah, we don't know Avodah Zarah here. They were unified. So what was wrong? They made a mistake. The mistake was God had instructed man, you have to spread out. We don't want people in one location. These guys made a mistake. And so why did God punish them so much? He didn't punish them so much. They did them a favor. They need a little bit of correction. Don't stay in one tower, one place. I want you to spread out. So when it says God spread them out, it means that God just helped them out. No. So interesting. So I want to show you an interesting thing. So this basically, you have this machloket amongst the Mefarshim here as to whether he's primarily a religious crime they were idolaters, that's what the whole purpose of the Migdal Bavel was, or whether you think it was, and I put it an urban planning mistake. They kind of thought that, you know, it's supposed to have a big city, they're meant to have like a center, they're supposed to have like a sprawling society, and so God just corrected them. If you look at the Ben Ezra, he says the builders of the tower were not such fools to think that they could climb to the heavens. They also were not afraid of the flood, for Noah's children to whom God had sworn not being the deluge were still alive. These things, the Ben Ezra thinks that the midrashim that Rashi's quoting, that's not pshat. So that's an interesting thing. So there's a guy in Israel. He teaches in Ma'ale Adumim and in the Gush. His name is Rav Elchanan Samet. He lives in Alon Shvut. Rav Samet wrote, he used to publish his articles on the Yeshivat Har Tzion website, the Gush VBM, the virtual Beit Midrash. There's a ton of stuff there that's in English you can access. He's also written a couple of, 2 different volumes of his works that have been written in his Iyunim and the Parsha Shavua in Hebrew, which are excellent. He has a great thing. He says, this is what it's all about. He goes, if you take a look, and I'll show you, I have a little picture there of a ziggurat. Now, a ziggurat you'll find was a common architectural phenomenon in ancient Mesopotamia. Okay, so if you take a look at what he says, I'm going to go to the. I'll read from the beginning. One who reads the story of the Garden of Eden, the previous parsha, does not ask questions concerning the reality of the story. Where is Eden located? What species was the tree of knowledge? How could the serpent speak, etc.? And rightly so, because that narrative, like many of the early episodes in Bereshit, has distinctly unreal quality. What about our narrative? In the opening lines, the narrative describes a known geographic area, a valley in the land of Shinar, or Mesopotamia, and its close, it names the city of Bavel, one of the oldest, most famous in the ancient Near East, mentioned repeatedly in inscription, the site of our earliest archaeological excavations. The city of Bavel is already very large in the earliest extant records, and its temple to Marduas was distinguished. Its towers its tower as well was the grandest in ancient Babylonia, earning it the appellation house, the foundation of heaven and earth. The ruins of this tower, which our episode deals with, are visible today for those who have the opportunity to stroll through rural Iraq, and they were excavated at the turn of the century. Basically, look at the next paragraph. We do not know exactly when the tower and temple of Bavel were built, nor do the ancient inhabitants of the city. But we do know the ancient inhabitants of the city were quite proud of their edifices, their construction to the gods themselves. The towers, or ziggurats, were meant to serve as a point of encounter between the gods, dwelling in the heavens, and man, dwelling on earth. With a stunning set of stairs surrounding the towers, allowing the priest to ascend to its apex. At the tower's top sat a temple in which the priest would meet the gods. So what Kasuta says is, you know what's going on? He quotes Kasuta, but what Samet is saying, working on Kasuta I mentioned earlier, he says, Migdal Bavel is clearly referring to paganism, referring to a ziggurat, which was well known as the tower in Bavel was the type of thing where people did worship. They worshipped Avodah Zarah, and he says very interestingly. Usually we think of the Rashbam and the Ben Ezra as the pshat guys who are on top of just looking at the psukim for its own sake, and they're not relying on midrashim. So this is an interesting instance in which the rabbis of the Medrash were closer both geographically and chronologically to Migdal Bavel. So you had Chazal who are offering this who are saying that these guys were pagans, idol worshippers, who were building this tower to fight against God. So Sam says, once you have a little archaeological awareness of the history here, Chazal were closer to the Pshat, he says, than the guys like the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam, who were living in Europe in the Middle Ages. Europe in the Middle Ages, you are not as sensitive to the reality of what's going on in Iraq. Look at the last paragraph. With this background in mind, it appears that the traditional exegetes erred in seeing the expression with its top in the heavens as hyperbole. The ziggurats architects and their fathers truly intended for the tower to reach the heavens, the residence of the gods. Knowledge of these historical and archaeological facts compelled Kasuto to explain a narrative as satire intended to mock the pagan pride of Bavel. So I want to show you 2 interesting things about this. He says that if you keep this in mind, also you understand something. And we'll end with this: the the words in the episode here. What does it say if you take a look at Pasuk Hey? What happened when after they built this tower? What does God do? Vayered Hashem. God comes down. Why does he come down? It didn't reach me. You didn't. You're not, the tower is not. No. You can't. You can't act. You can't. You're not even close. Vayered Hashem. L'rot derimigdal asher banu b'nei ha'adam. Because the ancient Mesopotamians believed that the gods themselves built these towers for their worship. No. The gods didn't build them. Asher banu b'nei ha'adam. That they are the ones who built it. Now, interesting also, Kasut also points out that when you look at what is Bavel in the Torah's version comes from what? It means that it says Sham. Alkin Kroll from Bavel. Hisham Balal Hashem Sfatcha. It created confusion from the word confusion, right? Whereas what does Bavel mean in the Babel mean in their version of Babylonians? It comes from Bava El. Bava means a gate, like Bava Kama, Bava Batra, Bava Metzia, right? Bava El means the gate of God. So, no, not the gate of God. Balal, confusion. In other words, if you look at, so what Samit and building on Kasuta want to argue, if you have a little bit of more knowledge of this archaeology here, what this purpose of the ziggurat was, you can understand what's going on in Migdal Bavel in a way that might be more rich had we only been relying on what we'll find in the Mikro Kedolo. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah,